So, you wake up, you choose your breakfast, you decide your mood for the day.
Right.
You really think you are the captain of your own ship. You probably assume that no one can truly control your actions or your feelings.
Because you're this uniquely autonomous, rational being.
Exactly. But according to the people who studied the deepest mechanics of the human mind, well, your autonomy is basically a complete illusion.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, it's probably the most pervasive comfort mechanism in the entire human experience.
Right.
We desperately need to believe that we are the conscious authors of our every thought, like we're totally separate from the biological machinery running beneath the surface.
But the historical records and the whole evolution of psychological science, they paint a much colder, much more deterministic picture.
Oh, absolutely.
Because when you really drill down to the root of human behavior, our methods of thinking aren't actually that unique. The way you process information, the way you react to stress, even the way you fall in love.
It's all entirely predictable.
It really is. It can be readily predicted by the people who spend their lives decoding the mind. Because everything you do, from the anger you feel when someone cuts you off in traffic, to the overwhelming joy of holding a newborn child.
It's all biology.
Right. It all reduces down to a specific triggering of neural impulses via brain chemistry. I mean, it is quite literally just numbers processing, like a computer.
Yeah, and you are really looking at the fundamental premise of psychology as a scientific discipline there.
Mm-hmm.
If we view the brain as this highly sophisticated computational engine, then psychology is just the rigorous study of those underlying computations.
Right. The goal has always been to move past that illusion of pure free will and understand the actual mechanical why and how of human behavior.
Exactly. Because once you map the biological and behavioral architecture of the mind, well, behavior ceases to be a mystery.
It becomes predictable. And that predictability is exactly why this matters to anyone listening right now.
Oh, 100%.
Because if you understand that you are essentially operating on highly complex biological operating software, you sort of gain access to the source code.
Right, you get the blueprint.
Yeah. Knowing the mechanical reasons why humans form attachments or how resistance and procrastination are actually triggered in the brain.
It gives you a profound advantage.
It really does. It's the architectural blueprint for building emotional intelligence and navigating relationships effectively.
Because understanding the mind allows you to stop fighting against your own psychological mechanism.
Right.
You can actually start utilizing them.
Right. But getting to that level of scientific clarity took, thousands of years of trial, error, philosophy, and experimentation.
A very messy history.
Super messy. Which brings us to our mission for today's deep dive. We are tracking the complete evolution of human thought regarding the mind.
It's a huge journey.
It is. We're starting way back in the ancient world, where abnormal behavior was literally blamed on external demons.
Cells and all that, yeah.
Exactly. And we are going to walk step by step through history. We'll meet the philosophers, the ancient scholars, and the scientists who slowly decoded this supercomputer.
All the way up to the foundations of modern cognitive behavioral therapy.
Yep. So to do that, we have to start at the absolute beginning, long before anyone even knew what a neural pathway was.
Right. We have to look at how the earliest human societies attempted to explain the completely unexplainable.
So, in antiquity, the prevailing theory of mind was deeply intertwined with the supernatural.
Right? Completely. It was all mysticism.
Like if an individual in ancient Greece suddenly began exhibiting erratic, abnormal behavior, maybe manic episodes or severe hallucinations.
Society just lacked the biological vocabulary to explain it.
Right. So the logical conclusion based on their worldview at the time was demonic possession.
Yeah. They viewed the physical body as a vessel that had been hijacked by some external malevolent force.
And the really fascinating part about that demonic possession theory to me is that it actually preserves the dignity of the patient's core identity.
Oh, that's a great point. Yeah.
Like, the community isn't saying that the person themselves is fundamentally broken. They're saying the person is just a victim of an invasion.
The mind is fine. It's just currently occupied by a demon.
Exactly. And so the earliest forms of what we might loosely call psychology were exorcisms, spells and rituals designed specifically to evict the invader.
Right, trying to restore the original occupant to control.
Yeah, and the methods were obviously steeped in mysticism,
Right.
but the underlying social mechanism is actually incredibly significant.
Because they were identifying certain behaviors as demonic.
Right, and by actively trying to treat them through ritual, These early societies were establishing the very first diagnostic boundaries.
Yeah, they were drawing a definitive line between normative human behavior and pathological behavior that actually required societal intervention.
Which is really the primitive root of clinical psychology when you think about it.
Yeah.
The desire to heal the individual and return them to a baseline of functional normalcy.
They were trying to fix the software. They just thought the virus was a literal demon.
I love that analogy. But the transition from mystical exorcism to actual medical observation happens shockingly early in recorded history.
Much earlier than people think.
Yeah, we have to look at the Edwin Smith Papyrus. This is an ancient Egyptian scroll dating back to roughly 1600 BCE, though it was bought in the 1800s.
It's one of the very first medical texts in human history.
It really is. And it mostly deals with battlefield trauma, detailing various physical injuries and gaping wounds and stuff.
Pretty gruesome stuff.
Oh, super gruesome. But hidden within this text is a realization that completely changes the trajectory of human knowledge.
Yeah.
The author notes that physical injuries to the head directly impaired the patient's motor and sensory functions on the rest of the physical body.
And to really appreciate the magnitude of that observation, you have to remember the context.
Right, the heart versus the brain debate.
Exactly. For centuries, many cultures, including the later ancient Egyptians who mummified their dead, believed the heart was the actual seat of the soul and human consciousness.
Right, didn't they literally pull the brain out through the nose and throw it away?
Yeah, the brain was often just discarded as useless cranial stuffing.
Wow.
But the author of this papyrus, who was likely a military surgeon observing blunt force trauma in real time on a battlefield.
They noticed a mechanical correlation.
Exactly. When a specific part of the skull was crushed, a specific part of the body stopped working.
It is the earliest recorded instance of localized neurological mapping. I mean, they didn't have MRI machines or even a concept of electricity.
But they could clearly see the cause and effect.
Yeah. The scroll actually contains the first recorded explanations of the physical structures of the brain, too, like the meninges and the cerebrospinal fluid.
That's incredible for 1600 BCE.
Right. It gave specific instructions on how to treat head injuries. And remarkably, it even provided diagnostic criteria for when a physician should essentially just walk away.
Recognizing that the neurological damage was beyond their capacity to heal.
Yeah, and this text fundamentally grounds human behavior and physical capacity in biological reality.
It's a massive shift, a full millennium before Hippocrates.
Right, the guy who is widely credited as the father of modern medicine in ancient Greece.
Yeah, 1,000 years before him, this Egyptian surgeon officially established that the brain is the centralized command center.
It officially separated the study of human capability from the realm of the ethereal, and it placed it firmly into the realm of the physical and the medical.
It's foundational.
So the Egyptians give us the first medical recognition of the brain's physical power. But observing a head wound is really different from actively testing the limits of a healthy mind.
Oh, for sure.
So for the first actual psychological experiment in recorded history, the documentation points to a 6th century AD Chinese scholar named Lin Zi.
Ah, yes. Lin Xi is fascinating.
He really is. He was fascinated by human focus and distraction. He basically wanted to measure our cognitive bandwidth.
And his experiment was incredibly straightforward, right?
Super simple. He tasked individuals with drawing a square with one hand while simultaneously drawing a perfect circle with the other.
Which is nearly impossible to do well.
Right. I picture someone today trying to text a complex, emotionally delicate email on their smartphone while actively navigating a crowded, fast-moving city sidewalk.
Oh, that's a perfect modern equivalent.
Yeah, like you inevitably slow down your walking pace or you bump into someone or you send a text completely full of typos.
Your brain literally cannot dedicate 100% of its processing power to both streams of data at once.
Exactly. He was systematically testing the parameters of split attention. But I have to ask you, looking at Lin Ji's test, drawing shapes on a piece of paper, was this actually a rigorous scientific experiment, or was it just a clever parlor trick to confuse his friends?
Well, the distinction between a parlor trick and an experiment lies entirely in the methodology and the intent of the observer.
Okay, makes sense.
A parlor trick is just performed for the sake of entertainment or illusion, but Lin Ji was actively manipulating a specific variable.
The introduction of a conflicting secondary task?
Exactly. He was manipulating that variable to actively measure the functional limits of human cognition. He was gathering empirical data on our vulnerability to distraction.
So he was actually doing science.
Yes. In the context of the 6th century, introducing a controlled scenario to test a hypothesis about human mental capacity. That is the absolute birth of experimental psychology.
Wow.
He proved that conscious attention is a finite resource.
That transition is just massive. It moves humanity from passively observing the mind to actively stressing the system to see exactly where it breaks.
It's a huge leap forward.
Now, while Lindsay was testing the physical outputs of focus in China, scholars in India and the Middle East were diving deep into the abstract concept of the self and the soul.
Right. Undertaking an equally massive project.
Yeah. We have to look at the Vedanta. These are a profoundly influential series of ancient Buddhist philosophical writings.
And they took on the incredibly abstract concepts of emptiness, non-self, and mindfulness.
Right. And the depth of their introspection resulted in a framework that is remarkably predictive of modern cognitive science.
It's actually kind of shocking how modern it sounds.
It really is. They sought to understand how a human being actually experiences reality. And to do so, they broke the human experience down into what they called the 5 aggregates.
Which are essentially the sequential components of consciousness.
Right. And the way these texts outline the 5 aggregates reads literally like a modern schematic for cognitive processing.
Let's walk the listener through the sequence.
Yeah, let's break it down. So aggregate number 1 is form. This basically represents the physical material of the universe.
Right. The stuff out there.
In their terminology, they related it to the classic elements earth, water, fire, wind. But practically speaking, form is just the objective reality of the object in front of you.
It is the tree, the rock, the incoming projectile.
Exactly. It exists regardless of whether you are actually there to experience it. So it's just the raw external stimulus before it ever interacts with the human sensory apparatus.
Which then triggers aggregate number 2.
Right, which is sensation. This is the exact moment that external form makes contact with your physical biology.
It's the raw, unfiltered data traveling through your nervous system.
Yes. And the Buddhist texts categorize these sensations into 3 highly clinical buckets: positive, negative, or neutral.
So simple, but so accurate.
Yeah. If you step on a sharp thorn, the sensation is an immediate negative biological alarm. If you feel the warmth of the sun on a cold day, it is a positive biological response.
Right. There's no complex thought happening yet, just raw physical data.
Exactly. In neurological terms, this is basically the afferent nervous system firing, right?
Yeah, the sensory receptors in the skin or the eyes are transmitting an electrical impulse up the spinal cord to the brainstem. It is an entirely precognitive reaction.
But raw data isn't understanding.
No, it's not.
That requires aggregate number 3, which is perception. Perception is the mental labeling process. It's the moment the brain recognizes the raw sensory data, organizes it, and assigns an identity to it.
Based on visual or auditory patterns.
Right. It's the moment you realize that furry quadrupedal thing on the couch isn't just a blob of form and sensation, it's a cat.
I love that analogy.
Or imagine you are walking in the woods at dusk. You see a long, curved, shadowy form on the ground. The sensation might just be a sudden neutral spike in physiological arousal.
Just a sudden alertness.
Yeah. But then your brain processes the shape and the context. Perception is the microsecond you assign the terrifying label, snake.
Right. Perception is where the brain's pattern recognition software kicks in. It's likely utilizing the occipital and temporal lobes to match the incoming visual data against a stored database of known shapes and threats.
And that label dictates the severity of the subsequent reaction, right?
Absolutely.
Which brings us to aggregate number 4, mental formations. The texts define this as the conditioning of a feeling or an action based on your previous exposure to the object.
It is your learned behavioral response.
Right. Once you perceive the snake, your mental formation dictates what happens next.
Yeah.
If you grew up handling reptiles and you understand the species is harmless, your conditioned response might just be curiosity.
But if you were bitten by a snake as a child...
Exactly. Then your conditioned response is sheer autonomic terror and the immediate impulse to run for your life.
And this specific aggregate maps flawlessly onto the foundational theories of modern behavioral psychology.
It really does.
By identifying mental formations, these ancient scholars were describing the exact mechanisms of conditioning centuries before the West would formalize them.
They recognize what Ivan Pavlov would later call classical conditioning, right?
Yeah, the involuntary autonomic physical response triggered by an associated stimulus, like your racing heart at the sight of the snake.
Right. And simultaneously, they captured what B.F. Skinner would define as operant conditioning.
The voluntary behavioral action, like running away, that is reinforced by the relief of escaping the perceived danger.
It's just wild. They understood that our reactions are not spontaneous at all. They are deeply programmed files.
Yeah.
And finally, overarching all of this rapid processing is the fifth aggregate, consciousness.
The big one.
Yeah. The text described this as the total meta-awareness of the entire sequence. It is the overarching cognitive space that encompasses the physical form, the raw sensation, the mental perception, and the conditioned mental formation.
All happening at the exact same time.
Right. It is the realization that I am a person looking at a snake, feeling fear, and deciding to walk away.
And by dismantling the illusion of a singular indivisible self and replacing it with these 5 interacting aggregates, the Vedanta really provided a highly sophisticated, mechanistic view of human cognition.
Brilliant.
They established that what we call the mind is actually a rapid, sequential assembly line of sensory input, pattern recognition, and conditioned behavioral loops.
All being observed by a higher order consciousness. That level of analytical breakdown in the ancient world is just staggering to me.
It really moves the conversation from mysticism into a systematic taxonomy of thought.
It totally does. And as the philosophical center of gravity starts shifting westward toward the Islamic Golden Age, we encounter a Persian scholar who takes this deep understanding of the internal mind and violently reconnects it to the physical body.
Yes, Abu Zaid Ahmed ibn Al-Balkhi.
Al-Balkhi. He is a monumental figure operating in the 9th century.
A truly brilliant mind.
And during a period when a lot of physicians were heavily focused on just anatomy, pharmacology, and surgical stuff, Al-Balkhi introduces a concept that was radically ahead of its time.
Mental hygiene.
Mental hygiene. He wrote this definitive text titled Sustenance for Body and Soul.
Yeah.
And in it, he systematically dismantled the prevailing medical consensus that physical health and mental health were completely separate domains.
He stated unequivocally that the human being is a unified system.
Right, the psyche and the soma are intrinsically bound together. He actually heavily criticized the medical establishment of his day for treating physical ailments while completely ignoring the emotional state of the patient.
Which is a critique you still hear today, honestly.
Oh, all the time. And he recognized a bidirectional causal loop that modern medicine is still actively researching.
Right.
He argued that if the physical body becomes sick or injured, the cognitive faculties inevitably degrade.
The mind becomes foggy, the mood plummets, you lose executive function.
Yeah, anyone who has ever had a really bad flu knows that feeling. But far more revolutionary was his assertion that the loop runs in reverse too.
That severe psychological distress will manifest as tangible biological illness in the physical body.
Exactly. We call that psychosomatic illness today. If you are enduring chronic, relentless stress at your job, your mind is obviously suffering.
But eventually that mental suffering translates into physical reality.
Right. You develop an ulcer, or you suffer from chronic migraines, your immune system crashes, and you catch every bug that goes around.
And Al-Balkhi identified this physiological cascade in the 9th century.
It's mind-blowing. He was mapping the early conceptual parameters of the gut-brain axis and stress-induced immune suppression long before we even knew what cortisol was.
Furthermore, he brought a really rigorous clinical taxonomy to psychological disorders.
He wasn't just observing that people felt unwell. He was categorizing the exact nature of their mental distress.
He became the first scholar to establish a clear diagnostic boundary between neurosis and psychosis.
And that is a massive distinction in the clinical world, even today.
Huge.
He defined neurosis as an emotional or psychological condition that causes deep, persistent distress to the individual.
But the patient's reality testing remains intact.
Exactly. The person is highly anxious or deeply depressed, but they still know who they are, where they are, and they can largely still function in society.
Psychosis, conversely, he defined by a fundamental fracture from reality.
Right. The patient experiences hallucinations or severe delusions. They completely lose their anchor to the objective world.
And by splitting these two categories, Al-Balkhi dictated entirely different therapeutic pathways.
Because a neurotic patient requires counseling and cognitive intervention.
Right. Yeah. Whereas a psychotic patient requires different, often much more protective and physiological management.
Yeah. He also identified 4 distinct emotional disorders that look remarkably like the chapters of our modern DSM the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders.
He categorized them perfectly.
He really did. He grouped them as fear and anxiety, anger and aggression, sadness and depression, and obsession.
Wow.
But his breakdown of depression is where his clinical genius really shines. Because he didn't view depression as a single monolithic dark cloud.
He divided it into 3 distinct mechanical types.
Right. First, normal depression. This is just the baseline sadness intrinsic to the human condition.
The grief of a fleeting loss or just having a really bad day.
Yeah. The second category is what he termed endogenous depression. And this is a profound leap in medical logic for the 9th century.
It really is.
He recognized that some forms of severe depression had absolutely no external environmental trigger. The patient hadn't lost a job. They hadn't suffered a bereavement.
Instead, he posited that this depression originated from within the physical body itself.
Right, an internal biological malfunction or chemical imbalance that resulted in a prolonged depressive affect.
And the third type.
The third type was clinical or reactive depression. This originates directly from a severe external circumstance or trauma outside the body.
So he understood these distinct root causes.
Yes, and because he understood them, he realized that you cannot treat all depression the exact same way.
Right.
If it's endogenous, originating from the body, he recommended medical interventions, changes in diet, physical treatments.
But for reactive depression and anxiety.
This is the best part. He pioneered a treatment that is incredibly familiar to us today. He was literally prescribing the earliest documented forms of talk therapy and cognitive restructuring.
To treat neurosis, he advocated for direct conversational counseling.
And the mechanics of how he actually treated a patient back then, without modern pharmaceuticals, are fascinating. He would sit with the patient and engage in a dialectic.
A conversation.
Yeah. If a patient was paralyzed by an irrational fear or crippling grief, he wouldn't just tell them to cheer up or get over it.
He actively worked to teach the patient entirely new methods of thinking.
Right. He would challenge their catastrophic thought patterns. He'd help them construct a totally different narrative around their trauma, fully understanding that changing the thought would eventually change the physical feeling of distress.
He was altering neural pathways through sustained cognitive intervention.
Exactly. He understood that the brain is plastic, and that by repeatedly guiding a patient through a healthier cognitive loop, the physiological symptoms of the neurosis would eventually subside.
It was just a staggering achievement in clinical psychology.
So we have this brilliant, holistic, deeply clinical understanding flourishing in the Middle East. But as the centuries roll on and the intellectual spotlight shifts to 17th century Europe,
Things changed drastically.
the approach to the mind undergoes a violent philosophical pivot. The thinkers of the European Enlightenment were just obsessed with definitive logic and pure reason.
Yeah, they looked at that messy, intertwined relationship between the mind and the body that Al-Balkhi championed, and they sought to sever it cleanly.
They wanted mathematical precision. And the champion of this movement was the philosopher René Descartes.
Descartes casts a shadow over Western thought that is almost impossible to escape.
He really does. He was a polymath, a mathematician who gave us the Cartesian coordinate system, and a philosopher determined to establish an absolute foundation of truth.
He is famously the author of The Ultimate Philosophical Anchor, right?
Cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am.
Right.
He decided to doubt everything in existence. His senses, the physical world, the sky above him, until he arrived at the one thing he absolutely could not doubt. The fact that he was currently thinking.
Therefore, the thinking mind must exist.
Exactly. But this logical exercise led him to a theory that would define psychology for centuries.
Dualism.
Cartesian dualism posits that the universe is comprised of two fundamentally distinct substances.
Matter and mind. Right. There is physical matter, which has mass and occupies space, and there is the non-physical mind, or the soul, which thinks but occupies no physical dimensions whatsoever.
So Descartes looked at the human body and saw a brilliant mechanical automaton. Muscles, bones, blood pumping like hydraulics, pure physical matter.
But the mind.
The mind was this ethereal, non-physical ghost. But the problem with dualism is immediately obvious to anyone who thinks about it for like 10 seconds.
It's the classic interaction problem.
Yeah. If the mind is a ghost and the body is a machine, how on earth does the ghost steer the machine?
How does a non-physical thought cause my physical arm to raise into the air?
Exactly. Descartes recognized this mechanical flaw in his logic, and he proposed a highly specific anatomical solution. He theorized that the mind and the body interacted at exactly one point in the brain, the pineal gland.
which is a tiny pine-cone-shaped structure deep in the center of the brain.
And the reason Descartes picked it is almost comical in retrospect.
It really is based on totally faulty anatomy.
Yeah, he was dissecting brains. And notice that almost every structure in the brain comes in pairs. You have a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere, two amygdalae, two hippocampi.
But the pineal gland sits right in the middle, entirely unpaired.
Right. And because there was only one of them, his logic dictated it simply must be the singular throne where the indivisible soul sits to pull the levers of the physical brain.
Even though we know today that the pineal gland primarily just regulates melatonin and the circadian rhythm.
Right, it's just the sleep clock.
Yeah.
But anatomically incorrect as he was, Descartes used this junction point to write a treatise in 1646 called The Passions of the Soul,
where he attempted to explain the mechanics of human emotion and irrational behavior.
because if the rational part of the soul is sitting in the pineal gland, calmly driving the physical body, why do humans act like complete maniacs sometimes?
Right, why do we lose control?
Descartes explained this by introducing the concept of animal spirits.
Such a great term.
It is. He argued that while the soul is in charge, the physical body is full of these animal spirits, which he called passions, that course through the blood and the nerves.
And sometimes these intense surges of physical emotion can overwhelm the pineal gland.
They temporarily hijack the machinery. And stripping away the 17th century terminology, Descartes is basically describing the physiological phenomenon of emotional dysregulation.
He identified 6 primary passions.
Yes, wonder. Emotional center of the brain essentially short circuits the
And
prefrontal
last,
cortex.
Which is the
about
part
your sister.
responsible for
At birth, and we are simply downloading data from our environment through our senses, then human behavior should be incredibly uniform and perfectly logical, data in, data out.
Right. If you and I both stand in the rain, our sensory input is identical. The water is cold.
We should both react the exact same way.
Right.
But we don't. One person laughs and dances in the rain, the other becomes miserable and angry.
The blank slate theory completely fails to account for the chaotic variance of human reaction.
Right, so it became evident that mapping the mind required looking beyond the mere accumulation of sensory data. Raw input is insufficient to explain behavior.
And that's where David Hume comes in.
Yes, the Scottish philosopher David Hume recognized this deficit in the mid-1700s, and he introduced a framework that brought the focus violently back to the internal passions.
He wrote A Treatise of Human Nature.
And his core thesis was a direct assault on the idea that humans are rational, logical creatures. Hume stated bluntly that reason is, and ought only to be, the slave of the passions.
That's a powerful quote.
It really is. He argued that logic and reason alone never motivate anyone to actually do anything. You can logically know that touching a hot stove is a bad idea, but it is the physical passion of fear, the terror of the pain, that actually stops your hand.
Hume was seeking the actual mechanical drivers of human action.
Right.
He understood that logic is primarily utilized after the fact, serving to rationalize or justify the decisions our emotions have already compelled us to make.
To explain how this mechanism works, Hume divided human emotion into highly precise categories: direct passions and indirect passions.
Let's look at the direct passions first.
Okay, so these are primitive, immediate emotional reactions that arise directly in response to physical pain or pleasure. Things like fear, grief, joy, hope, aversion, and desire.
Direct passions are linear cause and effect mechanisms. They are heavily reliant on the limbic system.
You encounter a stimulus, you experience an immediate physiological surge, and you execute a direct behavior.
You see a charging predator, you feel the direct passion of fear, you run away. It is an immediate survival loop.
But Hume's real genius lies in his second category, the indirect passions. These are the complex, distinctly human emotions: pride, shame, love, hate.
And here's the mechanical distinction.
Yeah.
Unlike direct passions that force an immediate physical action, Hume argued that indirect passions primarily influence thinking.
They don't force you to run, they force you to ruminate.
Exactly. The cognitive feedback loop of an indirect passion is incredibly complex. Let's use the example of shame.
Okay.
Shame does not usually trigger a sudden explosive physical action. Instead, shame functions as a pervasive cognitive filter.
Right. If you experience a deeply humiliating social failure, the shame infiltrates your neural pathways. It alters your self-concept.
So the next time you are presented with a social opportunity, you do not react based on the pure sensory data of the new event.
You react through the altered, restrictive filter of the previous shame. Hume recognized that these complex, indirect emotions permanently rewrite our behavioral algorithms,
dictating how we will approach similar situations years into the future.
So we are not just recording data. We are being continuously reprogrammed by our emotional reactions to that data.
It's a much more dynamic model than Locke's blank slate.
Definitely. But there's one more philosopher we have to consult before we leave the realm of pure thought, because Immanuel Kant looked at everything we just discussed: Descartes' dualism, Locke's blank slate, Hume's enslavement to the passions.
And he realized they were all missing the most fundamental mechanism of all.
Yes. Kant's contribution is arguably the most structurally complex, but it essentially bridges the gap between pure philosophy and modern cognitive psychology.
Kant was a German philosopher who rejected the idea that the mind was merely a passive receptacle for sensory data.
He looked at Locke's blank slate and completely dismantled it. Kant argued that if the mind were truly a blank slate, the massive chaotic influx of sensory data, every photon of light, every vibration of sound, every shift in temperature.
It would be an overwhelming, incomprehensible storm of noise.
Exactly. We wouldn't be able to process reality at all. Therefore, the mind cannot be a blank hard drive.
The mind must come pre-equipped with a complex operating system capable of sorting and translating the data the moment it arrives.
And Kant called these pre-existing systems cognitive faculties. So, to conceptualize this, do not think of the mind as a camera passively recording a movie.
Think of the mind as a highly active, real-time translator sitting in an earpiece.
Yes. The external universe speaks a language of pure, chaotic sensory physics. Your cognitive faculties take that raw physics, translate it, format it, organize it by cause and effect, and present it to your consciousness as a coherent, understandable reality.
Kant even argued that fundamental concepts like space and time are not necessarily objective properties of the universe.
Which is wild to think about.
They are cognitive faculties of the human mind. They are the formatting grids our brain uses to organize the data.
And the mechanical consequence of Kant's theory is just staggering. It means that human beings never actually experience the objective universe as it truly is what Kant called the noumenon.
We only ever experience the phenomenon.
Right. Our mind's highly edited, filtered, and translated interpretation of the universe.
He established the absolute parameter of subjective reality.
Because if my cognitive faculties process sensory data slightly differently than your cognitive faculties, then the physical room we are both standing in is literally a different reality for each of us.
The mind is an active participant in constructing the world we experience.
Kant's architecture is brilliant, but by the mid-1800s, this massive philosophical journey hits a solid brick wall.
Because philosophy demands rigid, logical boundaries.
Right, it builds airtight arguments. But human behavior is notoriously chaotic, messy, and illogical.
You can debate whether the mind is a blank slate or a real-time translator in a university courtyard for centuries.
But eventually you need empirical proof. You need data. You need numbers. To truly decode the mind, psychology had to violently sever itself from philosophy and become a hard, measurable science.
And the individual who engineered that separation, finally dragging psychology out of the philosophical armchair and into the laboratory, was a German physiologist named Wilhelm Wundt.
Wundt is the catalyst. In 1874, he published a massive volume titled Principles of Physiological Psychology. And the title itself was basically a declaration of war.
He was explicitly linking the hard physical science of physiology with the abstract theoretical study of human thought.
And 5 years later, in 1879, he did something entirely unprecedented. He opened the world's very first dedicated psychology laboratory at the University of Leipzig.
The establishment of that lab in 1879 is universally recognized as the exact moment psychology was born as an independent scientific discipline.
The philosophical era ended. The empirical era began. But Wundt faced a seemingly impossible mechanical problem. How do you run a scientific experiment on a thought?
Right. You can weigh a chemical compound. You can measure the velocity of a falling object.
But you cannot put a feeling on a scale. You cannot measure a memory with a ruler.
So the only tool Wundt had to attempt this measurement was a method he defined as introspection.
Introspection. In Wundt's specific, highly rigorous definition, this was the process of experimental self-observation.
He was not asking people to casually reflect on their day.
No, he was attempting to train individuals to become highly calibrated, objective measuring instruments of their own internal consciousness.
And his lab was incredibly prolific. Over the years, he trained an estimated 17,000 students in this method.
Which is an insane sample size for the 1800s. Let's look at how one of these experiments actually operated, because it highlights both the ambition and the ultimate failure of the method.
Okay, let's walk through it.
Wundt would place a highly trained student in a controlled room. He would then introduce a precise, measurable stimulus, perhaps a metronome clicking at a specific tempo, or a light flashing a specific hue of red.
The student's task was to immediately and precisely report the most basic, fundamental elements of their conscious experience in response to that stimulus.
Right. They were instructed to break their reaction down into raw sensations, isolating the pure acoustic tone of the click from the subjective feeling of tension or relaxation it caused.
Wundt was trying to map the difference between basic sensory apprehension and complex cognitive apperception.
And Wundt demanded that these 17,000 students report their internal workings completely free of any personal bias, interpretation, or emotional judgment.
Which is where the mechanical problem with this assumption becomes glaring.
Yeah, it is biologically impossible to objectively judge the inner workings of your own mind because the instrument you are using to measure the bias is, itself, biased.
Exactly. The methodology collapses under modern scientific scrutiny. The critical flaw of introspection is the complete lack of independent verification.
If a subject reports that the metronome caused a level 4 sensation of internal acoustic tension, I, as the lead researcher, have absolutely no secondary metric to verify that claim.
I cannot hook a monitor to their subjective experience.
Furthermore, modern neuroscience proves that the vast majority of our cognitive processing occurs entirely unconsciously.
The subject is physically incapable of reporting on the mechanisms generating their thoughts because they do not have conscious access to them.
Right. Wundt was asking them to describe the software code by just staring at the computer monitor. It doesn't work.
But despite the fact that his specific method of introspection was eventually discarded as unscientific, Wundt's impact remains astronomical.
Oh, absolutely. Because by forcing 17,000 students to sit in a laboratory, manipulate variables, and systematically record data regarding the mind, he permanently changed the paradigm.
He proved that the mind was a valid subject for empirical observation.
The scientific method had finally breached the perimeter of human consciousness.
Mm.
And once that door was opened, it could never be closed.
Never.
So what happens when you train a massive army of students in a brand new science and release them into the academic world?
Well, they immediately splinter into rival factions.
Yeah, they start warring over the correct way to decode the supercomputer. Wundt's disciples established the very first official schools of thought in psychology.
The two dominant frameworks that emerged to battle for supremacy were structuralism and functionalism.
And these two schools represented fundamentally opposed philosophies regarding the structural architecture of the mind. The first faction was structuralism, led by a fiercely rigid academic named Edward Titchener.
Titchener was a student of Wundt, and he took the concept of introspection to its absolute dogmatic extreme.
He really did. The core thesis of structuralism was that human consciousness could be systematically deconstructed into tiny, microscopic, irreducible components.
Titchener believed that the mind was essentially a complex chemical compound. His goal was to isolate the fundamental atomic building blocks of thought, the purest elements of sensation, image, and affection.
He wanted to create a literal periodic table of human consciousness. And to understand how exhausting this was, imagine a structuralist trying to analyze the experience of eating an apple.
Oh, this is a great example.
They wouldn't care that it's an apple. They would train a subject to bite it, and then demand they isolate the exact micro-sensation of the crisp acoustic crunch.
Completely separate from the isolated sensation of sweet acidity on a specific quadrant of the tongue.
Right, and separate from the minor spike in physiological pleasure, they were dissecting the mind into static, dead pieces to see how they stack together.
But the fatal flaw of structuralism was its rigidity. You cannot freeze a dynamic biological system to study it without fundamentally altering what it is.
Because Titchener relied entirely on his hyperspecific, unverifiable method of introspection, the entire school of thought was entirely dependent on his personal authority.
When Titchener died, structuralism essentially died with him. It lacked the pragmatic utility to survive.
And waiting to fill that void was an American challenger who offered a radically different, vastly more applicable framework.
William James.
The architect of functionalism. William James is a titan in the history of psychology. His monumental textbook, The Principles of Psychology, shifted the intellectual center of the discipline away from the rigid German laboratories and toward the pragmatic American universities.
James looked at Titchener's obsessive attempt to break the mind into dead, static building blocks and completely rejected it.
James argued that consciousness is not a brick wall you can take apart. He introduced the famous metaphor of the stream of consciousness.
Right, the mind is a flowing, continuous, dynamic river. You cannot isolate a single drop of water and claim you understand the current.
Functionalism fundamentally changed the core question being asked by researchers. Structuralism asked, what are the static pieces that make up the mind?
Functionalism, which was heavily influenced by Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, asked, what is the purpose of the mind? Why is it doing this?
Exactly. Functionalism demanded to know the evolutionary utility of our cognitive processes.
James argued that consciousness exists entirely because it is adaptive. It helps the human organism survive in a complex environment.
If you want to understand a behavior, you have to find its function. Why do humans experience the intense physiological sensation of fear?
Because, historically, the organisms that felt fear ran away from predators and lived long enough to reproduce.
Why do we form deep, irrational emotional attachments to our offspring? Because infant humans are entirely helpless, and that emotional bond ensures the parents will expend massive resources to keep them alive.
Functionalism was intensely pragmatic. It wasn't interested in the microscopic sensation of an apple. It was interested in how learning, memory, and habit formation actually helped a person navigate the real world.
And while functionalism eventually dissolved as an organized, named faction, its core philosophy triumphed completely.
The functional evolutionary approach to behavior is deeply embedded in the DNA of almost all modern psychological research.
So we've journeyed through an incredible timeline here. We've mapped the physical brain with the Egyptians, categorized depression with the Persians, debated the blank slate with Locke, tracked the cognitive translator with Kant, and built the scientific laboratories of Wundt and James.
We have amassed a staggering blueprint of how the machine works.
But there is a massive, glaring omission in all of this data.
The clinical application.
Exactly. If you have a patient sitting in front of you whose mind is profoundly broken, someone paralyzed by trauma or entirely incapable of functioning, all the philosophical theories and laboratory data in the world don't matter if you don't know how to actually fix them.
Understanding the mechanical architecture of the mind is only the first step. The ultimate goal of psychology is clinical intervention.
The transition from theoretical observation to active, methodical therapy required a massive paradigm shift. And that shift arrives in the late 1800s, courtesy of an Austrian neurologist who is undeniably the most famous, the most polarizing, and the most heavily debated figure in the entire history of the field.
Sigmund Freud.
Sigmund Freud. Now, regardless of the modern clinical consensus on his specific theories, Freud's impact on Western culture and the trajectory of psychological treatment just cannot be overstated.
He really engineered the architecture of modern therapy.
He introduced the revolutionary practice of psychoanalysis. What separated psychoanalysis from the academic debates of structuralism and functionalism was its direct clinical application.
Freud wasn't running experiments on healthy students. He was treating desperately ill patients.
And his entire framework hinged on one monumental concept: the unconscious mind.
Freud posited that the conscious awareness, a part of you that is listening to this sentence, the part that makes logical decisions, is merely the thinnest surface layer of the mind.
Beneath that surface lies a vast, hidden, inaccessible reservoir of repressed memories, primitive drives, and unresolved trauma. To visualize Freud's unconscious, do not use that tired iceberg metaphor.
Oh, the iceberg is so overdone.
It really is. Think of the mind as a modern smartphone instead. The conscious mind is the bright screen you are interacting with the app you currently have open.
But the unconscious mind is the massive hidden operating system running dozens of heavy, battery-draining background processes simultaneously.
Exactly. You can't see the code, you can't easily access it, but those hidden background processes are completely dictating how fast your phone runs, how hot it gets, and when it suddenly crashes.
And Freud argued that this hidden operating system secretly drives the vast majority of our daily behaviors, neuroses, and emotional reactions.
And Freud proposed a highly specific mechanism for how psychological distress originates. He argued that when an individual experiences severe trauma or harbors socially unacceptable desires, the conscious mind cannot tolerate the distress.
Therefore, the mind deploys defense mechanisms, primarily repression, to force that painful data down into the dark reservoir of the unconscious.
The problem is repressed energy doesn't disappear. It ferments. It builds pressure.
And eventually it forces its way back to the surface, disguised as neurotic symptoms, paralyzing anxiety, or inexplicable physical ailments.
So how do you fix it? Freud's mechanical solution was psychoanalysis. His method involved painstaking, prolonged dialogue.
Through techniques like free association or dream analysis, Freud attempted to bypass the conscious mind's security firewalls.
Right, trying to drag that buried radioactive material back up into the light of conscious awareness. The mechanical theory is that once the hidden trauma is finally exposed and processed by the rational mind, it loses its destructive power.
Freud called this release catharsis.
Catharsis, yeah. He constructed the fundamental mechanics of the talking cure. The idea that articulating a hidden terror diminishes its physiological grip on the nervous system.
Now, regarding Freud's historical theories, we must be precise here.
Right. The texts make it clear that Freud had some highly specific, intense obsessions regarding the contents of the unconscious.
He theorized that almost all repressed motivation was driven by psychosexual development, libido, and innate aggression.
And the source material explicitly notes that within the modern psychological community, the vast majority of Freud's specific claims regarding sexual motivations and his rigidly defined psychosexual emotional passions.
We analyze Kant's brilliant realization that the mind is an active translator of subjective reality, which finally catalyzed Wundt to open the first laboratory and attempt to measure the immeasurable.
Which sparked the fierce academic battles between structuralism and functionalism, ultimately paving the way for Sigmund Freud, who took all this accumulated historical knowledge, combined it with the concept of the unconscious, and birthed the modern therapeutic frameworks that save millions of lives today.
From ancient battlefields and mystical spells to the highly calibrated, scientifically validated interventions of the modern therapist's office.
We have successfully decoded the evolution of the human supercomputer. But as we close this deep dive, we cannot let you walk away feeling entirely comfortable.
Because beneath all the science and the historical progression, there is a profound, unresolved tension that lies at the very heart of the human experience.
It is the dichotomy between the external and the internal. We discussed John Locke, who argued fiercely that your mind is entirely constructed by the external environment, that your every belief, fear, and desire is simply a downloaded file from your past experiences.
And we just discussed Freud and the modern cognitive scientists who argue that your daily behaviors are heavily dictated by internal automatic processes running in an unconscious realm that you cannot easily access.
Which brings us crashing right back into the illusion of autonomy we challenged you with at the very beginning of this journey. You believe you are making your own unique choices every single morning.
So here is the question you must grapple with. If Locke is mechanically correct that your mind is just playing back the conditioning of your environment, and Freud is structurally correct that your hidden unconscious is actually generating your emotional impulses before you even realize it.
Who is actually in the driver's seat of your life right now? Is the conscious, aware version of you truly making autonomous choices today? Or is your brain simply running the complex, predictable biological software installed by your past, while your consciousness just sits in the passenger seat, comforting itself with the illusion that it is steering the ship?
That is a profoundly heavy, paradigm-shifting question to leave you with today.
A little mechanical existential crisis to chew on as you go about your perfectly predictable behaviors. But unpacking these massive fundamental mysteries is exactly why we do this. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly deep journey through the architecture of the mind. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.